Well, now we're going to have a little change of scenery, if you will. We're going to switch to the South Seas, the Pacific Islands. This is a mission field that is completely different from uh, what we see in Europe or in Asia or Africa. The islands were considered by many to be a sort of a paradise. If you could live on one of the Pacific Islands, or anywhere in that part of the world, then you were about as close to heaven as it gets. Well, just like anything else, that had its good side and its bad side. Um, Ministry in the islands uh, was very beautiful. Yes, the climate was very nice, except for the hurricanes and typhoons, things like that. The biggest problem that missionaries faced in that part of the world was the sexual temptations. The immorality rate was very high, partly because of the way people dressed, just the openness of um, uh, of the immorality, and this presented a temptation that unfortunately some missionaries did not resist. And so, even though it looked, very, very inviting, like the the best place you could imagine to be a missionary, this became a very, very real issue for them to deal with. So the first mission we're going to deal with didn't have that particular problem. Praise the Lord for that. He was faithful, and his name was John Williams. Don't confuse him with the composer. Totally different John Williams, missionary to the Pacific Islands. He was born in 1796 and lived till 1839. He was from England, as many of the missionaries we've studied came from England. Now, his country of service was Polynesia. Um, it's challenging to divide up the islands of the Pacific. Um, the geographers who mess with this part of the world have basically come up with three groupings of islands. And if we could zoom in, we would see that there are literally thousands and thousands of islands. The largest area is what is called Polynesia, and poly from the word many, so many, many islands. And and then you have Micronesia up on top, and micro because these are very small islands, many of them, and you may recognize the Marshall Islands by name. Notice that the Hawaiian Islands are probably more closely associated with Polynesia up there at the top of your screen. And then you had Melanesia, and Melanesia comes from a word that refers to dark, and because these were especially dark-skinned people who lived on these islands. And you can see that that takes in Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Fiji. We could work our way through all of these three groups and identify islands or groups of islands with which you would be familiar. And so this is the part of the world that we're talking about at this stage of the game. So let's talk a little bit about Williams. He had no formal Bible training, and he was hastily married and thrust on his way to the islands. A couple of comments about this. When it comes to formal Bible training, I think all of us understand that uh, there's nothing in the scriptures that demand that a person experience some sort of formal Bible training in order to be qualified to be a missionary. In Brazil, there was a pastor who served on the board of directors of the college where I taught, and he was one of the most respected and knowledgeable men in our region, Brazilian man, and he had no formal Bible college education, and yet, in addition to starting a couple of churches, he also had a radio ministry, and he wrote books, mostly devotional type books on Christian living, that sort of thing. But a scholarly gentleman, and he could talk theology with the best of them. So when we say he had no formal Bible training, what we're not saying is that this man wasn't qualified to be a missionary, because that simply is not the case. We're going to see shortly that Bible colleges began through the ministry of men like A.B. Simpson. We'll actually study him in just a bit. But so the fact that somebody has no formal Bible training doesn't disqualify him from ministry, but it can present some challenges when it comes to certain areas of doctrine. And it may also present challenges if you're ministering in a university town, for example. But John Williams didn't do that. He went to an area of the world where people were, very educated in a very limited sense of the word. So again, he was an effective missionary despite the lack of formal Bible training. And then the hastily planned marriage is another thing that I want to share with you. You can find several examples of missionaries who were married, let's say, in a hurry, and ended up heading to the mission field, even without a honeymoon in some cases, or the honeymoon becomes their trip, to the field. In some cases, missionaries would try to find a husband or wife simply to facilitate the work of missions. And in other words, it's almost as if, in some cases, getting married became more of a practical, missional endeavor than it was a question of, falling in love and the romantic part of it and all of that. So it's fascinating to think about. I would say to you that if you get married and are planning to go to the mission field, unless God just makes it clear that this is what he wants you to do, I would encourage you not to walk out of the church on your wedding day and hop onto an airplane headed for your first term of service. Not that that can never happen, and sometimes it has happened with great success. But make your marriage a priority. Take the time that's needed in order to really sink some roots into your relationship. You remember in the Old Testament that even in the Israeli culture, if a man were planning to go to war, being conscripted in the Israeli army, but he got married, he was actually given a year to stay home and to get to know his wife and develop their relationship before he would go off to war. And so, in principle, I would say that you need to take some time when you're first married to establish your marriage and get it well grounded before you head off, especially into a cross-cultural ministry, because cross-cultural ministry demands a great deal of time and energy just to adjust to a new language, a new climate, a new food, new customs. And if you're trying to do that at the same time you're getting used to living with another person, it can present some very, very real challenges for you. So it did happen before, and I'm not saying that you can't, but I would advise you to seek to avoid that if at all possible. Now, John Williams did something that I would consider very good, and something maybe that wasn't so good. Well, the not so good was he tried to change the civilization. Well, that wasn't John Williams. That was missionaries in general at that time. Remember, we talked before about colonialization and how missionaries just kind of assumed that you had to colonize a place with a culture that is Judeo-Christian. Part of the thinking is this: if you try to take the Christian gospel into a culture that's pagan, animistic, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever, the gospel is not going to be able to germinate in that kind of soil, if you will. And so the idea was, in order for the gospel to really be able to take root, the culture itself needs to be Christianized in order to make the gospel message compatible with society. And the fact of the matter is, the Bible does not teach that approach to missions. When you see in the book of Acts people going to various countries of the world, taking the gospel of Christ, their mission is not to Christianize the country where they're serving. It's to implant the gospel and allow the gospel to change lives, which can eventually change families, which can change communities. But we can't get the cart before the horse. You don't go in and try to change a culture so that the gospel will be compatible. That's not a biblical methodology. But again, John Williams was in good company because that was the thinking of most people involved in missionary activity. Now, one of the positives of Williams was his desire to involve the nationals in ministry, and he did that. He didn't look down on them as stupid, uneducated. No, he had the right attitude. These are very intelligent people, and when they had a heart to serve God, then they would soak in His Word, they would learn, they would catch on, and they would understand how to apply it in their own society, and they could become leaders among their own people. And so that is to his credit. Something very sad happened to John Williams, and you may have heard this story. He went back for what turned out to be his last furlough, if you will, back to England. And as he traveled around, I mean, he was an instant celebrity. Back in those days, people that traveled overseas were few and far between. And nowadays, you can talk to all sorts of people, even in your own church, that have been here and there and, all around the world, because travel is much easier now than it used to be. And so he'd go back and he'd tell stories about the cannibals there and about the people and the customs. And, he had people spellbound. He was very gifted. Well, he went back to the islands after that, and he, for whatever reason, determined to visit a specific group of islands. It was a group of islands that was known to be especially hostile. And when the boat that he was in was arriving at the shore, they noticed that waiting for them on the shore was a group of men. Now, normally there would be a group of people waiting on the shore when a visiting boat would come in, men, women, children. When you see only men on the shore in a case like this, it ought to raise a red flag. He should have wondered, why aren't the women and children here? In other words, the reason that there were only men is because they were there to do business as warriors. And this is something that apparently either he didn't take it into consideration, or he felt very confident that God was leading him there and God would protect him. Anyway, as the story goes, he got out of the boat, and he was met there by the warriors, and he was killed and eaten by cannibals, and it sent shockwaves around the world. Here he had been a celebrity back in England, and when news of that got back, it was all over the place. And Ruth Tucker, who talks about John Williams in her book, From Jerusalem to Irian Jaya, does say, that it's possible that because of all of the popularity, the fame, his celebrity status, it may be that he simply had become a little bit more confident about his own invincibility going back. Now, I don't want to accuse John Williams of that, but I do know that when anybody in ministry, whether it's missions or whatever you're doing, sees an abundance of fruit, sees the hand of God at work, it becomes very, very easy to take credit for that and say, wow, I'm really doing a good job, and almost to assume that God can't do without me, and so I don't have to worry about anything. Again, I'm not going to accuse John Williams of that, but it does seem a little strange that a man who knew the island peoples as well as he did would go forward with something that had danger written all over it. And that has left people wondering exactly, what happened. But again, as we've said so many times, here's a man who was vulnerable. He was a sinner saved by grace, just like the rest of us. And when we study lives like this, we need to study the good and the bad, the positive and the negative, and ask God to help us to know what we can learn and how we can grow, having considered their life and testimony. John Williams, Pacific Islands.